Okay, so we should get started. It's 11 a.m. here in Singapore, and it's Friday, 29 Jan 2021. We are well on this year already. So, on behalf of the Sing Health Duke-NUS Global Health Institute, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this webinar. I'm really excited that we've had a chance to kind of bring a whole range of perspectives and different presentations and different topics in our Global Health Seminar Series. So this is a seminar series we started last year, well, actually the year before, 2019. Initially, we used to have them in live, and now we have them online. And we've really grown our audience, and I'm really excited to see all the different kind of people who've registered for this. They're scheduled for the last Friday of every month, so please do look out for our emails on them, and the topics will vary greatly. Really, it's an opportunity to engage our whole community in different global health topics. And today's presentation is very pertinent to our current global situation. Our speaker, Dr. Benjamin Anderson, will talk about his work in the field of implementing a One Health approach, and he's going to tell you all about that. Dr. Anderson is an assistant professor of science and global health at Duke-Kunshan University. He has an MPH and a PhD in public health, and he's concentrating in One Health. His research interests and experiences are focused on emerging infectious diseases, zoonotic diseases, and viral respiratory pathogens. He has worked extensively in China and the US in animal agriculture and clinical settings. And his work is really at the intersection of global health research and public policy. So it's very kind of practically oriented to what can we do about these things. It'll be a privilege to hear him speak today. And I really look forward to getting kind of his insights on this, such a pertinent topic and so pressing to us. Before I hand over to him, I want to make a few housekeeping notes. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentation and even keep your video off just because of bandwidth issues. This webinar is being recorded, as you know. You can post your questions via the chat box at any time during the presentation, but we kind of look at them all at the end, and Ben will hopefully be able to address them. So I look forward to the presentation. Thank you, Ben, for being with us, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Amina, and also my sincerest thanks to the coordinating team for all your hard work in putting these together. I was quite amazed by how many people we can get to join these virtual settings, and so it's really a nice way to connect with everyone. I know that we have many different time zones represented, and so I'll say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are. I'm currently joining you from China. I'm located at Duke-Kunshan University, which is just about 2 hours away from Shanghai. And I'm delighted to talk to you about this topic today, emerging infectious diseases, and an area of implementation of research that I do called One Health. Now, the kind of outline of the talk is to start out with just a little bit of background about emerging infectious diseases, though I feel like because of the pandemic, whether you liked it or not, I think everyone has gotten a bit of an education on emerging infectious diseases over the last year. But I want to highlight a few things that I think are really important to note about emerging infectious diseases related to their emergence, the cause of them. And then I'm going to introduce the One Health concept, the One Health approach, talk about some specific examples about how we use the One Health approach. I'll talk a little bit about some other paradigms that I know I've gotten some pre-seminar questions about, including EcoHealth and Planetary Health. And then I want to end on some challenges and maybe a way for us to start our discussion for the Q&A session. Anytime I talk about emerging infectious diseases now as a faculty member, I always like to begin with this slide here. This was published in Nature in 2004 of Dr. Morens, David Morens from the National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Disease. And this was a landmark article on emerging infectious diseases that presented a summary of the factors that are associated with emerging diseases. And then this was in there. And it's a really nice summary graphically of some of the key emerging, and he has the labels here: newly emerging, re-emerging, and deliberately emerging. And just kind of outlining the global distribution of what we knew at that time about these events. Now, in 2017, Dr. Morans updated this figure and presented that on the NIH website. And I share that with the students in my class typically, and I like to do a comparison exercise. So I'll do that with you here today. This is 2004, and then this is the updated figure in 2017. And I asked the question, what do you see that's different? Are we increasing or decreasing in the number of items on this map? And of course, the students are able to easily identify that we're increasing. And so I asked the question, are we doing better or are we doing worse in terms of emerging infectious diseases? And so they always will say, well, it seems like we're doing worse. Now, the caveat to that is we have amazing technology that's developed over the last 20 years that allows us to detect things that we wouldn't be able to before. So some of this is likely an artifact of surveillance. But the fact that we can go out and find a lot of these new pathogens is a concern, particularly for newly emerging diseases. And then also of note of concern is the fact that we had old diseases that have reemerged, that have caused some major outbreaks and major morbidity and mortality throughout the world. Now, because of the pandemic last year, Dr. Morans and Dr. Anthony Fauci, they published another update on emerging infectious diseases in, in the journal Cell. And I encourage all of you to go and look at this article. It's a really well-written article summarizing this. And they have another figure, the same figure updated. Now I was a little dismayed because it looks like they hired a graphic designer and they've changed the features. So now I cannot contrast this as easily, but if you study this figure, you'll see that even within the 3-year span, there's even more additions to this map, and it's beginning to shrink so much that you can hardly read some of the text because it's so small. Also in this article, though, they do a wonderful job, again, talking about factors related to emerging infectious disease, but they emphasize a lot on this idea of pandemic disease, that we have many, many different examples of outbreaks of diseases, new pathogens or pathogens that cause localized outbreaks. We're starting to see a really interesting uptick in pandemic diseases. Now, they argue that this isn't new. Of course, history is riddled with examples of pandemic diseases as listed here in this table that they present. But even thinking in the last 100 years, some of the major pandemic events that have occurred and unfortunately the large death tolls that have resulted from them, even in an era where we have increased medical capacity and public health infrastructure, we're still seeing these events take place. And of course, the question is why? They say in their article as a conclusion that it seems that we have entered a pandemic era, which is not a good thing. So just to kind of get us on the same page with emerging infectious disease and factors related to them, talk a little bit about some determinants of emerging infectious diseases. I say some because this is not an exhaustive list. There's others that are not represented here in this table, but these are some key ones that we look at. And you'll see some that you could probably imagine are important to even the current pandemic. Some of the things of note, though, that we talk about when we're trying to understand emerging infectious disease, the factors that contribute to them and the challenges that exist in their control. And that's one of the key things is why are emerging infectious diseases so challenging to control? Well, a couple things that I want to highlight for you that relates to determinants of emerging infectious diseases. Number one, the ability for people to travel so easily. Now, travel is markedly reduced now because of the pandemic, but prior to the outbreak for the pandemic taking off, the predicted rate of increase of travel was 8-fold and even going higher than that exponentially. So we're starting to see globalization and people moving rapidly throughout the world, which of course can carry with them everything that they have in terms of infections. And of course, even analyzing the pandemic, how did the pandemic get from the origin of outbreak to spreading throughout the world? Well, air travel is basically one of the primary routes that took place. Not unique to COVID-19, also something that was important to SARS, but thankfully when SARS happened, the transmissibility was not the same, and so the outbreak died out. But air travel has been, is, and will continue to be a really significant component and a challenge for the control of not just regular infectious diseases, but this idea of if we have pandemics emerge, how rapidly those viruses or bacteria or whatever agent is causing that pandemic can move throughout the world. Another issue related to this in terms of globalization is food safety issues around how we get our food and produce it. This is just looking at a map of a salad where you get production of these different items all over the world, but this creates a unique situation where, again, you can move pathogens pretty quickly in product that you're shipping to different parts of the world through commerce. And even I think in the last couple of weeks, there was some new guidance even in China about the risk of potentially the risk of virus found in some food products that they listed here in the markets. And I think even salmon, so fish, was on the list of concern. We also have changes in the way that we behave as a population in different parts of the world, and this will continue to be a trend that will grow throughout the world of food production. And this is focusing mostly, this slide, on protein production, meat production. And as we have more individuals who rise in their economic status, their ability to buy protein will increase, and we'll continue to see a rise in demand. This has been really pronounced in China, where the rise in demand for pork and poultry has increased exponentially over the last 10 to 15 years. And as a response to that, the industries have had to adapt practices to concentrate production to keep up with that demand. And so we're in a situation now where we have an intensification of agricultural meat production in different places of the world that have unique risks associated with them. And this is not unique to just pork and poultry. This is also something we see in industry, aquaculture being one, producing shrimp and fish. And some of the unique risks that we see associated with this intensification of meat production are related to pathogen transmission. And an area that is of concern that connects to emerging infectious diseases is this concept of zoonoses, or this transmission of pathogens from animals to humans. So if you have an intensification of production, you have large numbers of animals being produced in the same location, often maybe under sometimes stressful conditions, then you have a chance to create a conducive environment for pathogens to thrive. And if you mix people with those animals, workers or other people who come in contact with them, then this could be a really high risk potential for transmission of those pathogens between animals to humans. In addition to pathogens, there's some other risks that are also associated with food production. Antimicrobial resistance is an issue that's going to be continue to be a challenge for emerging infectious diseases, but I want to bring it up here because of this connection again with food production. A lot of the antimicrobial resistance that we're seeing, some is related to maybe antibiotic misuse in clinical settings or among humans, but actually a large percentage of antimicrobial resistant pathogens are now being traced back to farms, being traced back to animal production sites. And there's a really well-known case now of starting to see this particular strain of bacteria that's resistant to colostin, and it was first identified in China, traced to pig farms in China, and cases of it have begun to pop up in different parts of the world, including the United States. And what we're seeing is that this is also being transmitted through travel. So going back to global travel and transportation, people are able to take these with them if they're exposed, and then they move around in a rapid way. I want to mention one more factor that I think is important to note. Maybe it's a bigger concept, but climate change. The reason I mention it is because I think it's really significant and important to pay attention to climate change or climate factors as they relate to emerging infectious diseases, because we know that climatic factors are really important to the ecology of not just viruses, bacteria, but the host in which those viruses and bacteria live. And an important example here would be things that are vectored. So mosquitoes, we're seeing a lot of changes in mosquito habitat. So in places where it was once too cold for mosquitoes to thrive, as you have warming of temperatures, then you have movement of those vectors, and that's going to create problems, and potentially you'll get either re-emerging, resurging events like we saw with Zika or chikungunya. But you may also get some new viruses if you have new mixing of vectors with different hosts. Well, an area that we focus on, and coming back to this idea of zoonoses, this is something that is kind of highlighting various diseases. These are emerging infectious diseases that have occurred in the last 20 years. And the question is, what is the common denominator between these examples? And so when we ask that question, and I ask this to students, I think about it, and a lot of times they get it and they know exactly it's animals. So these are all associated with animals or some animal reservoir. So either originating in animals or an animal being an important part of the transmission pathway. And going all the way back to that first image in the article 2004, Dr. Moran's, and some of the work that that was published just after that, identifying that what we know now is that at least 60%, maybe more, sometimes estimates up to 75% of emerging infectious diseases in humans are due to zoonotic pathogens, or put another way, viruses and bacteria or other microbes that can transmit between animals and humans. And this feature that these pathogens are twice as likely to be associated with emerging diseases than our non-zoonotic pathogens. So a really significant feature here of this idea that there's a close connection between the risk of emerging infectious diseases and the way that people, animals, and the environment interact. And that's really going to be, that's the key to this, this presentation, this interaction of focusing on the relationship between animals, humans, and the environment. And as we go through and look at all these challenges, food safety, climate change, zoonoses, and food production, you know, it can be a little depressing actually. And kind of leaving us with what, you know, this is the biggest challenge I think we face with emerging infectious diseases. And one way to summarize this, why it's so challenging, is because it does feel overwhelming. And partly because there is, what we know is there's no one discipline trained to engage these problems. They're complex and they're intricate, they're integrated with other issues. There's no one agency or organization that we can turn to that would be the one size fits all fix for these issues. And what we're facing a lot of times is the reality that we have limited resources, either within our local context or even understanding now in an international global context. There's some situations where maybe the infrastructure just doesn't exist, or it's already stretched thin. So what do? What's the solution? Well, what I'd like to present to you today is one perspective. And before I get to the perspective of talking about One Health specifically, I want to take a little bit of a step back and give just a little bit of a historical perspective. The reason I'd like to do this is because I found it to be impactful to my understanding of how to think about how we evolved to getting to this idea of having something like the One Health approach. And also I'm a faculty member at Duke-Kunshan University, which is a liberal arts university in China. And as part of that, we have a curriculum that focuses on not just the science, but also the history, the arts, social science. And I have my office sitting next to several historians. And so I have been influenced quite greatly by their discipline. And so I want to just give a little bit of background here. This idea of humans and interacting with the environment, with animals, as it relates to health is not a new concept, right? So it's not something that just became an aha moment. the history is littered with the examples of people talking about this relationship. And I really enjoy Hippocrates, this particular treatise on airs, waters, and places. It's something you can look up online and read. Really a wonderful piece of writing. But even as far back as 460 to 377 BC in his time period, writing on this idea of the relationship with weather and temperature, the quality of water, really highlighting that even though there wasn't advanced scientific understanding of microbial theory and viruses, et cetera, people understood that there was a relationship there between how we interact with our environment, the quality of the environment, and how that can affect our health. And fast forwarding even further than that, we've had a lot of great minds that have been known to medicine, and particularly human medicine. Here, Rudolf Virchow, known as the father of pathology, but was always writing about this relationship between animal and human medicine, even explicitly saying here, there's no dividing line, nor should there be. So recognizing that treating humans and animals, this idea of connecting the two. Moving even further in the 1800s, we have Sir William Osler here, who is one of the co-founders of Johns Hopkins University, was a very prolific figure then, discussing not just human medicine, but this idea of prevention, and brought in a lot of ideas around environmental health. We have James Steele, who was really prominent in establishing one of the first official divisions at US CDC around veterinary epidemiology and preventative health. And then fast forwarding to Dr. Schwab, who I want to note because he was the one who first wrote about this concept of one medicine. In clinical medicine, I think some people have heard about one medicine if they've not heard about One Health. And his background was that he was working as a clinician, but also was working in a veterinary college in California and the United States, and was able to, again, kind of bridge this connection between the health of our environment, the way that we treat animals, and the way that we treat humans, and that there's a close connection between those three domains. Something that happened, a lot of things, there's more history that we won't get to today, but it's very fascinating. There's some publications on this you can go look at, but one of the kind of key turning points that sets up this introduction of the term One Health was that in 2004, via the Wildlife Conservation Society, had a meeting. And there was a lot of interaction taking place between professional societies. And that time in the United States, it was between the Veterinary Medical Association and the American Medical Association. So the veterinarians and the doctors got together and realized that we need to have more collaboration. We need to work more closely together in order to be able to have a leg up on addressing some of these new challenges, including infectious diseases. And you can see this is the same year that publication by Dr. Morans was released for emerging infectious diseases. And this meeting is where they first came up with the term One World, One Health. And that was what it was calling for, is some interdisciplinary approach to help us prevent disease, not just human disease, but diseases in general that could be affecting not just humans, but animals as well. And that is what led to now this focus of this presentation, which is One Health. And that's what I have my training in. I did my PhD in public health in one of the first One Health programs that was set up in the United States, concentrating in One Health and getting specific training in this. But what is it? How is it defined? Well, if we look here, it's defined as one definition here by the American Veterinary Medical Association is the integrative effort of multiple disciplines working locally, nationally, and globally to attain optimal health for people, animals, and the environment. Again, that connection between the three. But I also want to say that there's some varied definitions that I think are important to note, because One Health is something that has been embraced and has been incorporated into several key institutions and agencies. One of them here being the World Organization for Animal Health. They define this as a collaborative global approach to understanding risks for humans and animal health. They have an emphasis here on wildlife, not just domestic animals, and introducing this idea of ecosystem health. And then we have the World Health Organization, of course, which is predominantly focused on human health issues. But here they say an approach to designing and implementing programs, policies, and legislation. And so something I appreciate about this definition is, again, bringing in the connection, not just about treating and clinical medicine and epidemiology and research, but also understanding that there's a close connection here with policy. And then there's other groups. This is one have good friends now out of One Health Sweden who see this as a broader definition of recognizing that there's many things that could fall under One Health, many things that connect to health, connect to the environment, connect to people and animals could be included. So One Health is basically, in summary, a paradigm that looks at, that calls for an approach that emphasizes collaboration, particularly interdisciplinary collaboration on all levels, local, national, and international, and global level, in order to address issues of health that are occurring at the human, animal, and environmental interface. But that's not the only paradigm. And so I've been talking about One Health for several years. I go on and I do research talks, and I'm flying the One Health banner, but there's some other paradigms that exist as well that I want to mention, because even there were some questions about this that were sent to me before the start of the talk. One of them being EcoHealth. I think there's actually many members in this presentation you're watching that are involved in EcoHealth. The EcoHealth Alliance, a major organization that's doing a lot of emerging infectious disease research throughout the world. And some of the key pillars of the EcoHealth approach is systems thinking, transdisciplinarity, participation. They emphasize gender and social equity, sustainability, and knowledge to action. But this kind of key emphasis here is something called an ecosystems approach. And so question is that different than One Health? Well, I mean, arguably you could say that there's some features that are different of prioritizing different things. There's been a number of articles written on this that have talked about, where there's overlap, where there's synergies, and maybe where there's some things that are unique to the two different paradigms. I think, in my personal opinion, I think there are a lot of overlaps in them, and I think they're important. They're nice that there are some overlaps, but I also appreciate that there are some varied differences in maybe how they're applied and the approaches that are taken. And I think, it's kind of thinking about, here they use the analogy of wine, but I like to think of the analogy of ice cream. Strawberry, chocolate, vanilla, they're all different flavors, but they're all ice cream. And so I think anything that can lead us to getting to optimal health of systems, of health systems and ecosystems around human animal health issues is good. On another note, there's a third one that has received some attention that was announced not too long ago, and that's Planetary Health. This has been picked up and promoted by Lancet, by the editor-in-chief of Lancet. And in this particular paradigm, they're emphasizing human systems, but you'll see here they have political, economic, and social factors that they're ascribing to that. And another emphasis on looking at natural systems. So this relationship between the human system and the natural system, and how we can basically optimize those so that we can increase the ability for the natural world to thrive and for humans to thrive. Now, I think in this one, there's not as much of an emphasis placed directly on the relationship between humans and animals, but that's kind of built into the natural system definition. And they had a pretty nice launch of this. There's a lot of media around it, and there's a lot of different advertisements about, it's a time for a new discipline, it's time to think differently. Again, falling in line with some of the same calls to action that One Health and EcoHealth also were doing. Point out just one more article of reference if you're interested in looking at this a little bit more. I know that there's some potential, not criticism, but just kind of issues around if you've got multiple things going at the same time, they can compete for resources. But if there's enough resources for everyone, it's not an issue. And I think this article talks really well about the kind of comparison between these three approaches, where the overlap exists. And there's a lot of overlap between the three, and where the three might be differentiated and actually be beneficial. Okay, so we understand now that One Health is a paradigm. It's a view of interdisciplinary research, of working together to address complex issues at the human, animal, and environmental interface. But what does that actually look like? So I wanted to share just a little bit about our approach, what we take, and this is speaking from my research and also as part of a larger team, which I'll share a little bit later, the Duke-NUS team, and that we try to think about how to conserve resources, how to maximize the resources in order to have the greatest impact on identifying and capturing data on emerging infectious diseases. And you know, I don't want to say that our approach is so simple it can be summarized on just one slide, but maybe that's true. This is really the approach that we take, in that we're doing is we're identifying emerging infectious disease hotspots. We're taking all that knowledge that I mentioned before about animal production sites, knowing that, you know, high density of animals where contact with humans, there is a potential risk of zoonotic transmission, and that's where we can see spillover of emerging infectious diseases. If we can focus our attention on those hotspots, we can use a sampling strategy that is One Health oriented, meaning that it's not just focused on humans, it's not just focused on the animals. We're actually collecting specimens from each of those domains. So we collect specimens and data from all three. And then we're using the best that we can of testing strategy, the most advanced testing strategy that we can use, and that I'll explain in just a second, is using a combination of molecular and virology-based techniques. And then we add on to that at the end, having a very thorough risk characterization using some quantitative epi method, so that we can actually describe that risk in a quantitative way, measure it, and share that with the scientific community or the policy-based community. What I do a lot with this approach is I focus a lot in pig farms, because that's a hotspot we've identified to be very important to viral ecology. Influenza is a big one, but there's a lot of other things that are associated with pig farms in terms of the ability for pathogens to circulate and transmit there. And I work in China, and China is one of the largest producers of pork in the entire world. They produce over half of all the pork, actually. And that estimate is predicted to rise even more as the demand continues to rise, and maybe China becomes more of an exporter of pork. And so because of this, they have a lot of the same operations that have been developed in other countries, including the US and the Netherlands, where you have intensification of swine production, where you can rear maybe 10,000, 12,000 hogs at a given time. So that's a lot of animals in one location. And then, of course, workers having exposure to that, potentially having a risk of zoonotic transmission. So what we like to do is go in there, and we like to use this One Health approach, meaning that a sampling strategy that encompasses human, animal, and environmental sampling. And so we'll work with the workers, we'll collect some survey data, and then we'll take some biological samples from them, maybe nasal swabs or nasal washes. Sometimes we'll do blood. We'll sample the animals. We try to use approaches that are non-invasive. So we'll use things like oral secretion sampling, collecting them from ropes, so pigs chewing on ropes. And then we have environmental sampling. So here we like to use something called bioaerosol sampling, which is a non-invasive way to sample the air and capture not just genetic material, but also live viruses. We can actually isolate live virus and bacteria from the air. And we take all of those samples back to our laboratory, and that's where the laboratory infrastructure becomes really important. You have to have for our approach, we have to have a laboratory that can support this kind of testing, and we do, and that's what's really nice. And what we try to do then is we use a combination of what I said was molecular and virology-based approaches. Some approaches where we have kind of this large surveillance using genomic sequencing is one way to look at collecting data, and we can get some data from that. But arguably, there's a question of risk. What is the true risk? If you just capture genomic information, what is the risk actually of what you found? And what we like to do is, because we're focusing more narrow in these specific environmental hotspots, we add in the virology. It gives us a chance to capture data on whether or not we can isolate a virus when we're focused mostly on viruses, and be able to do characterization then of that virus. And I feel like that gives us a little bit more robust data on when we're ready to do characterization of the risk, when we have that isolated agent, when we have that pathogen isolated. So you could fill in the blank. It doesn't have to be pig farms. It could be other environmental hotspots. So again, the kind of condition being where there's high density of animals and high density of people having contact. Live bird markets are another area, or live animal markets, which was implicated in the outbreak of COVID-19. Other areas where there's wildlife, or where you have humans coming into contact with wildlife, would be hotspots to look at. And the advantages of this One Health study design is that because we're capturing data, not just on the animal, not just on the virus or the pathogen or the person, we're capturing data on all three. It gives us a better understanding of the true viral ecology. What's actually happening? How is that virus or that pathogen moving between those three domains? And then it ultimately gives us a better impression of what the environmental risk assessment is, what factors in the environment that we've collected, whether they be climatic factors, whether they be environmental, structural factors, man-made built environment factors, etc. It provides us a stronger evidence of zoonotic transmission risk. So if we can have the human and the animal sampling done, and we can show that the pathogen is originating in one and going to the other, that's a lot more stronger evidence than if we just say we found it in a person. We don't have that link to the animal. That gives us stronger evidence of that transmission. And then I think it maximizes our resources. I think we're able to do this kind of pathogen discovery work in a way that is not, that's making decisions about, when to do certain kind of more expensive laboratory testing, particularly sequencing. We can be more conservative and I think have a higher hit rate when we do actually sequence those samples out, because we've already isolated or identified them using the virology techniques. So that's an advantage I think are really helpful. Challenges. I wanted to have a section here of challenges. I originally was thinking, I've been doing emerging infectious disease research now for, 10 years, but I've only been a faculty member for about 3 years. And there's a lot I'm still learning. And I'm learning a lot even by working with colleagues who are doing this, who've been doing this for a long time. But I've just kind of had some observations of what are some challenges that exist in being able to not only research emerging infectious diseases, but have an impact, mitigating the risk, reducing the risk of future pandemics. I've been asked that question a number of times over the last year. How do we prevent this from happening again? I don't think anyone has a clear-cut, one answer that says this is how we do it. But some of the challenges that I've observed is, one, an economic issue. When prevention strategies work, the budgets are at risk. So this is more within government agencies, but we've seen that there's been a lot of published papers now that have shown a lot of public health budgets being slashed over the last couple of years. And some of the features of those budgets is prevention. So when it works and there's no outbreaks, well, that's good. And that means the prevention's working. But when you start to cut the budgets and you reduce the infrastructure, then when you do have an outbreak and you need that infrastructure, it's a catch-up game. This is also related to policymakers, the supplemental spending. So we need that surge of money. It's very reactionary. It doesn't happen until there's a major issue. And so now there, a lot of money was put in, and there was a big response to COVID-19. But again, it's a reactionary issue. I wonder if that money was invested in the beginning, if that could have prevented the outbreak. I don't know. It's hard to say that for sure, but that's the idea of thinking for the future. Making sure we have that investment. And understanding that it's a cost benefit. This virus is estimated to going to cost over $30 trillion for global output. So the investment is worth it, I think. Reputational risk is something we run into where we have governments and industries that don't, if you find something, it could be potentially either embarrassing or it can harm the economic productivity, particularly in industry. And so we want to be very respectful of that. It's a real concern. So if we're working with a pig farm or a pig industry, and we say, well, we find this new virus and that causes them to be shut down, that's a major impact, not just on them, but on the local community, on people, on the farmers. And so this is where in One Health, we really want to advocate for a partnership approach where we're kind of coming together and figuring out how to do this in a way that minimizes that economic impact and allows them to continue to operate. And I think governments have an important role in that as well, being able to be open and transparent and have protections in place for people to be able to have transparency of data. And then we have political will, which I'm feeling more strongly about this. I've done some work in policy. My wife actually has worked in government for many years. And as a researcher, I'm doing my research thing, I'm publishing, I'm generating data. I'm trying to think, how can I have an impact? Well, if the research that I'm doing is never making it to effective policies, it's never reaching the policy mechanism, the impact that the research we can do is always going to be limited. It's just going to be contained within the scientific community. So I think what I've noticed with particularly the outbreak COVID-19 is, how do we increase advocacy from science to policy, translating the findings we have to policy, not just during a crisis mode, because there's more political will during a crisis period, but how do we increase that during non-crisis periods where we can get that political will to institute systems and policies that are going to be able to promote prevention, pandemic prevention in the future. This is an article that talks a little bit about efforts in the US that was promoted by One Health Commission to get legislation. And that's kind of a unique thing for some research groups to be dabbling in legislation and promoting legislation and working with lawmakers. But I actually would argue we need to do more of that. We need to be we need to be bigger advocates for policy. And then last, collaboration is something that's built into the One Health approach. Also demonstrated through the pandemic is that there has been incredible collaboration, I think, particularly when we look at the early part of the pandemic. And, if you look past the media and kind of the stories and kind of the back and forth that governments have been doing at each other, the scientific community, I think, really came together. And there was a great sense of urgency and camaraderie and sharing of information until, as much as they could, until maybe some governmental interventions. But this idea of transparency among the scientific community. And I think it was really interesting in the beginning, a lot of the collaboration of sharing of information internationally was occurring through these kind of networks of relationships that researchers had, particularly with Chinese researchers, with those outside of China. And those had been relationships that had been established for many, many years of research working relationships. And those were something that were really prominent in the beginning of being able to share information, particularly the genetic sequencing data and some of the early work on characterizing the virus. So these are challenges. What are the solutions? This is not a talk to offer a solution. This is just to say, raise the questions and we can think about that. And maybe if anyone wants to comment on that in the discussion Q&A. But I, as a young investigator, 3 years into my faculty position, this is the question I'm asking myself. What are the solutions and how can I be a part of that solution? Thinking through some of these key challenges that I've observed. Last thing I want to do is end on kind of our larger network that we're trying to, that we have. This is under the leadership of Dr. Greg Gray, who I think is in this talk and in the participants. room, and he leads this out of Duke University, also works out of Duke-NUS and Duke Kunshan. I represent the Duke Kunshan group, but we have partners all over the world. And that example of One Health I showed you was just one example. And we're trying to implement a lot of those types of projects in many different parts of the world in order to build this collaborative network aimed at reducing risk of emerging infectious diseases and increasing our research opportunities. With that, I want to thank you for your time. And of course, I'm happy to engage in any questions moving forward. Back to you, Amina.
Yeah, Ben, thanks a lot. That was a fascinating run through, a lot of these aspects of One Health, which I think, as you said, people have been exposed to it a little bit, through the COVID-19 pandemic and, discussions around it. But this was a nice kind of structured way to view it. I'm glad. Thank you for ending on a kind of positive note of the good collaborations that, the scientific community at least has been able to kind of come together on. So it's always good to have that. And also, while people, please, I would encourage people to go ahead and put their questions in the chat group and we look at it. And maybe while you're thinking of the questions, I'll make one comment. So Ben, you mentioned a number of different articles, related to different topics. It would be great if you could give us, I mean, we can take it from the presentation also, but, get those links as far as possible. If, copyright and all those things allow it, we will post the entire articles on our website along with the recording of this. We've been trying to do that, with all our webinars that kind of give a set of readings so that people can, who want to delve deeper, have that opportunity. Where, there's copyright reasons, we'll at least give the abstract so that, and then people might have to go and get the actual article themselves. So just everyone to note that, and then when you and us can kind of, connect on that and make sure that we have, the pertinent readings for people who are interested to do more. So while people are thinking of their questions, maybe I'll ask a general kind of, maybe I thought maybe we'll end with this, but maybe we can start with it. So you gave a lot of examples and, discussions about the One Health, particular, what you do in your surveillance, how you kind of gather your information, what you do with it. But in the beginning of the talk, you also talked of the larger systems, the food systems, the commercial systems that generate us agricultural products, So especially from a policy point of view, how does one even begin to think about, and then the second is which is even more difficult, to bring these very disparate groups together. So even there's that smaller One Health, okay, we are humans, animals, environment, but then it's food system, agricultural policies, there's so many population growth, there are all kinds of different issues. How do you want to my brain actually gets a little bit fuzzy when I'm trying to think, how do you bring it all together? We actually did have a couple of webinars on this, when we were trying to look at it in the context of COVID-19, and there were huge issues raised, like including our philosophical underpinnings of, our capitalist mode of productions, lead to certain ways of interacting with the environment and, have led to this. So I know it's a lot to throw at you, but kind of big picture thinking, what do you say?
Well, my response, I mean, just the disclaimer is that, this is just limited to my perspective being a researcher, right? I'm not a policymaker. I've done some research on policies. I understand political systems, and we do some of that work at DKU. But I think what I've observed and what may be a really important factor to look at is the economic drivers. I mean, economics has really played a major role in how governments particularly have decided to respond to the pandemic. And I have a colleague who focuses on this research, and she's done a lot of comparisons across looking at the way that governments have designed interventions or decisions they've made on policies. And it's not to say that that's the only factor that every government has considered, but it's a really important factor that has driven some decision making. Particularly if you look at some of the challenges that face the United States. And the argument has come, kind of this dichotomy has been produced that it's, either the economy or it's the health, right? It's either economy or public health. We're going to sacrifice our economy for the good of public health. And some policymakers may not want to do that because there's other issues related to economics. So that's on a macro level. So we're talking about how do we insert this into government policy? Well, I think it's a slow process, but I think crises will speed up that process. And if this pandemic doesn't encourage a more rapid shift in thinking on the policy level, then I'm really concerned. I don't know what will, because this has just really clearly demonstrated and revealed a lot of the vulnerabilities that exist, not just in public health infrastructure, but other types of political or policy-based systems. And my hope is that that will encourage people who maybe weren't aware of this kind of stuff, the risk around emerging infectious diseases, to now have a knowledge about it and to have more of a concern for it. And I think the second thing I'll just note is, as I ended talking about advocacy, I think there is something to be said about more scientific advocacy. So having people not just trained in science, not just trained in this One Health approach or other types of scientific discovery, but being able to also be interfacing on the policy side directly, people who are even trained in that, to have this kind of scientific diplomacy, so that what is, because a lot of this isn't new. You talk to a researcher who's been doing this for many, many years, and they're like, well, the COVID-19 pandemic was not a surprise. They're not surprised by it, but then it's a surprise to governments. So if there's a way to translate that knowledge and confidence within the research and scientific community to governments, I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I see we have a question from Shreya, who's our research associate. And I don't know, can you read it or do you want me to read it out?
Oh, yes, I see it here. So COVID positive clusters were found in meat production units around the world, especially in the US and UK. Was a One Health approach taken in response to these clusters, and how integral will such a One Health approach be to inform public health interventions amidst the current pandemic? I can speak to this to the United States because I'm familiar with, we had this situation happen where we had a number of meat packing companies impacted by really large spikes of outbreak of COVID-19. So it created a unique epidemiological question. What about those settings was causing this increase of risk of cases? I wish I could say for the US a One Health approach was taken. I think one of the challenges that existed was again, the government response was very, at least on the national level, was kind of restrained and restricted, not I think from a public health perspective what we would hope, but there actually is more, I think, action that took place on the local and the state level. I think in these locations where these outbreaks occurred, there are a number of leaders within this thinking of One Health. I won't say specific states, but there are a lot of people who do this kind of work. And I know we're trying to get involved in figuring out what was going on in those settings. But the idea being that we still had these really large outbreaks, localized outbreaks in these meatpacking industries. And so the question was, could we have prevented that? I think a lot of people are looking at to try to figure out what the conditions were. I think it's a combination of things, including social economic status and pressure to work among certain populations, migrant workers, et cetera. But I would say that maybe a One Health approach wasn't used as well as it should have been in those situations.
Right, thanks. So Lynn asks, I think you addressed it a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more, the difference between the environmental health link with One Health?
Right. So the environmental health link is, my master's actually is in environmental health. And in that, we kind of think a lot about these environmental factors. I think indirectly, we think about interactions that might take place with organisms in the environment. So animals and humans who exist in the environment kind of are indirectly a part of that. What One Health tries to do, though, is it explicitly links those three things together. It's saying that it's important that we understand environmental health issues and factors related to environmental health, and how explicitly the host factors, the human factors, not just biological, but also behavioral and the animal factors, how at that intersection those things connect to create specifically events of emerging disease. So I would say environmental health is a really important component to that. What the One Health paradigm tries to do is to bring in these other disciplines like veterinary medicine, preventative medicine, epidemiology, and clinical human-based medicine into the fold to kind of specifically draw those disciplines together in order to have an impact on that question of risk around emerging diseases.
Great. So there's a question from Jun Hong. Again, can you read it, or do you want me to read it out?
It's when modeling what proportion of people should be vaccinated against COVID to achieve herd immunity, should we be taking into consideration the prevalence of infection in animals, the birds, the share, how should I mean, it's a great question. I'm not sure I can answer in terms of how it would relate to the calculations for herd immunity in humans. I guess what my comment would be, though, is that you have identified the fact that if this virus, and we know from data that's been published that there are animals that are able to be infected by the virus, and we know that the likelihood of it originating in an animal, though it's yet to be determined which one, is very likely. And so if this virus becomes established in animals as an animal reservoir, and you have particularly close interactions between that reservoir and people, could that reservoir serve as a way to reintroduce and amplify that virus to the population? And the answer is yeah. I mean, hypothetically, yes, it would. And actually, we've seen that before. A lot of the work I mentioned, Dr. Gray, I would embarrass him a little bit, but he did a lot of work on pandemic H1N1, and he actually was one of the researchers that showed that that virus was going back and forth from pigs to people and was being reservoired in pigs. And so that is something that would be of concern. And so when we think about moving forward, how to, I don't think we'll ever see, maybe we won't eliminate this virus, but animal reservoirs are going to be an important part of research to understand how persistent the virus would be in certain animals and whether that could be a risk for future spillovers if we have a population that is immunologically naive to that virus.
Yeah. So the next question from Gerald, I'm not sure that's quite in the orbit of what your presentation is about, because it's really asking about US policies of containment. So I don't know if you want to address that or go on to Simone's question, which talks about technological advances.
I'm just reading it. So it's hot topic question. I've been asked it before. I won't spend a lot of time on it. I'll just briefly say, you said the type of responses the Chinese government had in response to COVID that helped them to get back to normalcy, and how different was it compared to the US in terms of policy, seeing as the US is still having difficulty bouncing back? Are there any policies lacking that's inhibiting the US? It's really challenging to compare the two countries because their systems of government are so different. But I think you'll see that the responses are reflecting their government structures and the ability for the government to respond. And that's, I think just the most basic way to respond to that question. Other people can take that further and talk about good or bads and pros and cons, but I think it's just every country has used whatever government structure they've had. The response has been reflective of their ability to actually implement those interventions. And the US just has some unique challenges when it comes to public health interventions that happen on a national level. And there's a lot of other complicated factors involved. So I guess that would be my answer to that one. And then the next question I see from Simone is, you mentioned how we have advanced in terms of technology from 2004 to 2017, 20. Is there a flip side to some technological advancements such as modern farming methods that put us at greater risk for EID? How do we balance the One Health impact versus technology and science moving forward? So what I was referring to more for technology was, I think, our diagnostic technology, the ability to detect diseases has increased substantially with the advent of next generation sequencing, new molecular diagnostic assays, including conventional and real-time assays that are now very cheap to perform, platforms that are more affordable and more, easily, we're able to easily buy them and set them up in laboratories. And there's also, new point of care assays in clinical settings and also in animal health settings that veterinarians can use. In terms of production, animal production has shifted to a more efficient production model where they're trying to maximize productivity and efficiency, and they have some technology to reduce risk of disease, but I'm not sure I could say that it's a technology that can eliminate the risk. I mean, we still see within farms that are really implementing strong biosafety and biosecurity protocols, and that's what the approach is to have really strict biosecurity measures in these farms. There are still ways in which those biosecurity measures can break, and if that happens, then you still have the risk because the viruses are still circulating in the animals. So I think it's still an area where we need to continue to research, partner with the industries, and to be able to have a better understanding of what that risk is in order to prevent large outbreaks from happening.
Well, with that, we're also exactly at 12 o'clock, which is our time. And there are no more questions. So I will just close with another thank you to Ben, and thank you to the whole audience for being with us. And for Ben, it was really great to have you here. I know last year we had initially talked about you coming to Singapore, and of course, we would have asked you to give a presentation while you were here. But at least we got to do this virtually, and we do hope we'll have to be able to make the face-to-face presentation and meeting at some other point. But thank you very much. I think the audience must have gained a lot from that. And we look forward to further discussions on this. And we'll certainly, like I said, post the webinar, the recording of this webinar, but also the links to, relevant articles. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Be safe.